So Christianity's big, like really big. There are almost more people in the Catholic Church than China, with a third of the world's population identifying as Christian. Around 2.4 billion people. The impact of one carpenter from a Roman backwater province has on the world today is truly staggering. However, since Jesus has walked the earth, a lot has happened to the church that he passed down to his disciples. Today, 3 churches encompass the majority of Christians, those being the Catholic, the Orthodox, and the Protestant churches respectively. What I'm hoping to do in my first 4-part video series is break down the history of these 3 churches whose influence truly sprawls on a global level. Now, you're probably wondering why I said 4-part for 3 churches. And the reason for that is, before we talk about the Orthodox and the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church that sprout out of the latter, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the Catholic Orthodox Church, or the church before the Great Schism of 1054. While both Catholics and Orthodox claim to be that original church with their own arguments as for why, I'm going to just focus in this video on their shared history. If you're interested in more information, I'll leave some links to other videos down below. But that said, let's jump into it. Now, we could start our story in a lot of places, but I think the best would be 33 AD, 40 days after Jesus is said to have ascended into heaven, and leaving behind 11 apostles. Remember, at this point, Judas was kind of hanging with a different crowd. So the remaining 11 were commissioned to make new disciples and to spread the faith, thus beginning the early spread of Christianity outside of Judea. Now the apostles spread the faith across the old world, utilizing the legendary Roman roads and easy access to sea-based travel. But make no mistake, the early spreading of Christianity was not an easy process, especially in Jesus' home province of Judea. Because while the apostles were extremely dedicated to spreading the faith, to killing them so they couldn't do it. Usually by stoning or clubbing, although some did get crucified. Never like Jesus though, either upside down like St. Peter, or on an X-shaped cross like St. Andrew. And unfortunately, those were the mild ways to go, especially since some were skinned alive. But regardless of the brutality faced by early Christians, the faith slowly began to spread across the Middle East. And it spread all the way to modern-day Ethiopia, Iran, India, Pakistan, Ukraine, and Southern Europe, which was definitely helped by the conversion of Saul of Tarsus to Paul. He was originally one of the aforementioned persecutioners of Christians, but in an ironic twist of faith, he converted to Christianity and became one of its staunchest supporters. He planted churches across the Mediterranean and sent letters to them encouraging them in their faith. These letters became a keystone in the biblical canon and Christian theology today. This was until his eventual execution or martyrdom at the hand of the Romans. So, by 100 AD, Christianity had a steady spread outside of its center at Jerusalem, and as it did, a church hierarchy started to be established. Originally, there were numerous churches scattered across the world, which in turn would plant more churches in their area and that would repeat the process, all in a fairly disorganized manner. By the 2nd century, bishops would be acting in authority over the churches in their city, with the bishops of larger cities being called exarchs and the bishops of smaller cities being called metropolitans. Soon after, the 3 Petrine sees were established, which was the Pope in Rome, the Pope in Alexandria, and the Patriarch of Antioch, all residing in the 3 largest cities of the Roman Empire, all basing their legitimacy off of their namesake, the Prince of the Apostles, St. Peter, who resided in Antioch, sent Mark to Alexandria, and then died in Rome. They also all had a dominion over large portions of the church, with the Pope in Rome having the largest reaching, all the way from the Balkans to North Africa and all of Western Europe. And now, because the church is all organized nice and neat, it's time for heresy. And there were dozens of heresies that rose up in the 200s and 300s alone. It seemed that everyone in every city cracked the perfect way to do Christianity, and we'll have more about that in my video about Protestantism. But the early church was swamped in divisions and sects, attempting to split off. Again, stay tuned for my video about Protestants. But just to name a few, there were the Monantist, Quartodecimist, and Adoptionist. Oh my god, that was hard to say. But the 2 early big ones were the Gnosticists and the Arians. And no, not those Arians. But the Gnostics come from the Greek word gnostikos, which means to know, not to be confused with agnostics, which means to not know. Confusing, I know. But they believed they had some hidden knowledge that gave them some special connection to God, that God revealed to their founder, Heracleon. The church immediately tried to stop this exclusive Christian club from spreading, but they never really did, and its descendants of Manichaeism, which merged with Gnostic Christianity, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism, died out in Europe fairly quickly but lived in Central Asia for 1,000 years. If that wasn't enough, Roman Emperor Diocletian decided it was time for another purge of Christians, and purged thousands of them from 303 to 315. Until he died and his successor, Galerius, decided not to slaughter a large religious minority. And then finally, Constantine the Great became Christian and made the official religion of Rome. Talk about tonal whiplash. Now that the Christians weren't being constantly murdered, they could go back to their favorite thing, arguing theology. Which returns us to Arianism. Now Arius believed Jesus was created by God, and then raised to a divine status, and not always a part of the Trinity. Now this might not seem like a big deal, but it divided the church, and it seems like a Great Schism was coming way ahead of schedule. Constantine was hoping that Christianity would keep his empire together, but it seemed to divide it more than ever. In 325, he called all the clergy that would answer, a truly ecumenical amount of clergy, and got them all together in a room in the city of Nicaea, where he promptly told them to figure it out. So they yelled at each other for months until they finally decided that God the Father and God the Son were the same substance and equal. Constantine was great with this, and he promptly exiled Arius and his followers, but one of them, Eusebius, I think, returned years later. So the Arians, no relation to Evil Mustache Man, slowly were able to take over society and started persecuting everyone that disagreed with them. Okay, so maybe some relation to Evil Mustache Man. They then spread their beliefs in modern-day Spain, where the Germans were. So maybe a little bit more relationship with Evil Mustache Man. And then they create a counter-creed to the Nicene Creed, which was made at the Council of Nicaea. Carried on with authority for 40 more years until Theodosius demanded that all Roman citizens abandon Arianism and return to the Catholic Orthodox faith. And then boom, it's time for another ecumenical council, this time at Constantinople in 381. This was to fully canonize the idea of Trinitarianism, or how we view the Trinity today, which in shaky terms is that God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all the same substance as God. And even though this ecumenical council was mostly done by just the bishops of the Church of the East, what we modernly think of the Orthodox Church, the Western Church quickly adopted it, still proclaiming it as ecumenical. However, the ecumenical council also made Constantinople, the then capital of Rome, a holy city on par with Alexandria and Antioch, only behind Rome, which the Pope of Alexandria and the Patriarch of Antioch were not happy about. They saw that the Patriarch of Constantinople was trying to pull a fast one and use his connection to the emperor to raise himself up. Seeds of dissent will become important later, but for now, the Roman Empire might be split, but at least the Christian world is safe. But wouldn't you know it, knock knock, it's the Visigoths. Being Germans who were pushed from their homeland by the invading Huns, the Visigoths were pushed into Italy and sacked Rome. No, until the Pope came out and told them, Visigoths, go home, you're drunk. Which they happily obliged, left, and then began sacking Spain. But they weren't the only one. Since those Arians wanted more screen time, they promptly swept into Africa as another German tribe, the Vandals, and carved out a kingdom amongst themselves in the crumbling Western Roman Empire. But forget the crumbling Western Roman Empire, Christianity thought. We have more heresy to get through. This time by an Antiochian bishop and Patriarch of Constantinople, Nestorius. He said Mary was not the mother of God, but simply the mother of Christ, which Alexandria and Rome thought was pretty neat. Or at least a pretty neat way to get exiled, so they held another ecumenical council in Ephesus. Yes, that Ephesus, where they agreed that Nestorius should totally leave, and the Roman Emperor agreed. This started what is known as the Church of the East, which spread through Persia to Central Asia, even as far as China and Japan, until it was finally crushed in the 15th century. But let's get back to the 400s. The disagreements between the patriarchs and the popes made the church ripe for the first schism. Unlike in the past, where heresy would rise up, a controversy would spread throughout the church, and then a council would end it, this time the council broke the church apart. That council is one of the more famous ecumenical councils, the Council of Chalcedon. This time it was over the nature of Jesus. After all, the idea that Jesus was both man and God was kind of a confusing concept. And what that really meant, the church really didn't have a strong understanding of. After all, did Jesus have two natures or one? In Alexandria, the Miaphysites believed that Jesus had one nature, that of God in a man. But the Patriarch of Constantinople argued that he had two natures. Both asked the Pope in Rome to side with them, and everything came to an head at the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And after months of debate, the council concluded that Jesus did have two natures, that of man and God, that had no contrast between each other. It then may have also raised Constantinople to the second highest city in Christendom again. So then the Pope of Alexandria just said no and left, and he took Egypt and the Levant with him. This religiously split the Eastern Roman Empire amongst the North and the South. So at this point you have the Catholic Orthodox Church, the Miaphysite Church, and then the Nestorians. And this division is what is seen to finally have ended the idea of the three Petrine sees. And then, a couple decades later, the Vandals sacked Rome and the Western Romans completely collapsed. And then the Ariakean Schism happened, where the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome broke it off with each other until they reconciled in 515. At this time, Justinian of the Eastern Roman Empire was pushing the Arian Vandals out of North Africa, and was retaking Italy and Rome from the Arian Ostrogoths, only to lose Rome again, with which the Ostrogoths sacked again, and finally he was able to keep it and push the Arians back. And then there was the Fifth Ecumenical Council of 553, which was really all about making sure that everyone was on the same page, that Nestorius wasn't a homie anymore, and weirdly didn't mention the Arianists or the Miaphysites, which is really weird because the Arians kept on sacking Rome. But I guess it makes sense since the Pope was able to convert the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths to Orthodox Catholic understanding of Christianity. Arianism slowly fizzled out amongst the Christian populations of Spain, France, and Germany. But no time to enjoy that. The plague of Justinian just arrived, and the Persian invasions is falling behind it. So half the population of the Eastern Roman Empire just died. Much of the population of the empire is now being occupied by the Zoroastrian Persians. So the truly Heraclean task of reuniting the empire falls on Heraclius. Well, that's quite fitting, actually. And somehow, even though the Slavs started invading from the north and the Persians were invading from the east, even so far as marching on the city of Constantinople, he somehow managed to push both armies back and successfully push the Persians back to their initial borders of 623. Heraclius might have been able to restore his empire, but the Eastern Romans' greatest foe and eventual conqueror was just starting to rise out of the south. In the historically irrelevant Arabian Peninsula, the fire of Islam was lit, and both Rome and Persia would burn. You see, while the Persians and Romans were killing each other, thinking that they would be the only great powers in their neighborhood, Islam was starting to spread across the Arabian Peninsula. And this region was considered to be strategically unimportant to the two great powers. It wasn't until they both exhausted almost all their wealth and manpower trying to destroy themselves that the Islamic Rashidun Caliphate popped on the scene and flooded over their borders with devastating efficiency. By the time the two realized what was going on and tried to ally with each other, it was too late. Muslims took Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, all the Levant in Egypt, and North Africa from the Christians. They also swept through Persia and conquered it all in a matter of years. And after the Rashiduns fell into the civil war, becoming the Umayyad Caliphate, they attempted to take Constantinople, but were repelled by the Eastern Romans in 861. The Miaphysites welcomed the Muslims in and fought alongside them against the Eastern Romans. So the Second Council of Constantinople officially condemned the Miaphysites as heretics and negligent to the faith. But the Umayyads continued to push the Christian nations back from North Africa, and they eventually conquered all of Spain and pushed to France as well. They were finally stopped and defeated at the Battle of Tours. But back in the east, a new schism was brewing, as Christians started to wonder how they were so badly defeated by the Muslims. In the Eastern Roman Empire, some believed it was because the churches had icons of what Jesus looked like. This began the iconoclasm. The iconoclasts destroyed any depiction of Jesus and the saints, and they exploded in the Eastern Roman Empire in the 700s. It also attacked historical practices like the veneration of the saints. The East Romans were also grinded down by endless wars with the Bulgarians and the Muslims, which allowed the Germans to take possessions in Italy, pushing the Greeks out of northern Italy and creating the Papal States. However, the iconoclasm was still spreading across the Christian world, and finally, the last universally recognized ecumenical council by both Catholics and Orthodox happened in Nicaea, where it all began. This one, 400 years later, officially ended the iconoclasm, reuniting the Eastern and Western churches. This followed with the conversion of Denmark, along with Norway and Sweden, spreading the Christian world into Scandinavia. However, the relationship wasn't perfect. The two had disagreements on rites, rituals, and practices, which were different between the eastern and western halves of the church. This difference was especially inflared in southern Italy, where an eastern Greek population clashed with the western population of Italians and Normans. The German Carolingian Empire and the Greek Eastern Roman Empire also had a very tense relationship with each other. These issues were extremely noticeable when it came to the conversion of the Slavs to Christianity. An Eastern Roman, Cyril, developed an alphabet to convert the Moravians to Central Europe. But the Pope decreed that the Bible could only be read in holy languages like Latin or Greek, even though none of the original Bible was ever written in Latin. Regardless, Cyril and his brother, Methodios, had to plead to the Pope in Rome until he cleared their mission. But by the time they got to Moravia, they were forced to flee to Bulgaria. Here, and only after they died, was their alphabet, based on the Greek alphabet, able to gain traction, where it slowly evolved into the Cyrillic alphabet, where it was used to aid in the conversion of Slavs from Bulgaria to Russia. Regardless of this great success, the church in the East didn't like papal interference with their missions, and in the West, there was the rising issue with the Filioque, which was a slight change to the Nicene Creed which began to spread in the 500s, but became very popular in the West by 1000. So divisions were already starting to spark in the church, which made a part of the creed going, I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father, to add, and the Son. Now, the importance of this small semantic change is it changes how the Trinity is understood, which if the Miaphysite schism shows us anything, can lead to a massive problem for the church. There's also a difference between the idea of chastity within the clergy, since in the Eastern Church it was okay for priests to get married and have kids, while that was extremely taboo in the West. Furthermore, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Cerularius, grew wary of the growing influence of the papacy over the patriarchs. He believed that the Pope was only supposed to be the first amongst equals, and now saw him posing as more as the ultimate authority on the world. So he began to refuse listening to ambassadors from the Pope, and said Latin churches in the Eastern Roman Empire have to use Greek liturgy, or worship. So on July 16th, 1054, after a church service, the Patriarch found a letter from the Pope declaring his excommunication from the church. The Patriarch said, "No you," and excommunicated the Pope in return, even though the Pope had died before the message had ever made to Constantinople. This is when the Orthodox Catholic Church becomes the Orthodox and Catholic Church. We'll pick up this story the next time. But for now, thanks for watching, and avio.